As Howard said, I'd like to talk about the tax consequences of the cliff and the deal that was struck to avert it. Back in October, my colleagues and I issued a report that looked at all the tax things that were bundled up in the fiscal cliff. You had on your seat and you see on the screens, and perhaps at home you see on your screens, a chart of our primary results of that study of what was looming and what was possible in the fiscal cliff. And what I want to do is just quickly remind those who have seen it before, or introduce those who have not, what this chart shows, and then compare it to what actually happened. Okay. So what the chart here shows is how much people's tax rates would have gone up if we fell entirely off the fiscal cliff. So the vertical, read it as being in percentage points. If you look at the all column to the far right, you'd see that on average across all taxpayers at the end of last year, tax rates were scheduled to go up by about 5 percentage points, okay, which is a lot. There's a reason that people in Washington and in the commentariat were freaking out about that. That would be a gigantic tax increase. What we have on the left of the chart here is lining up households by how much income they earn. So you can see what the effect would be on households of different income levels. We divide them into fifths from lowest to top. So for example, you can see that in the middle quintile, kind of the middle income folks in our nation, they were scheduled to have a tax increase of just short of 4 percentage points. That would have raised their tax rate from about 14% on average at the federal level to about 18%, and that would have been the equivalent of about $2,000. And then the other group I'm going to particularly focus on, the top 1%, since they were such a focus of the debates we saw. You can see that they were scheduled, if we went entirely off the cliff, to have a bigger tax increase. In percentage point terms, it would have been about 7 percentage points, would have raised their tax rate from about 31% to 38%. Okay, so first conclusion of our study was it was a big deal. There was a big pending tax cut, basically for all Americans, right? You can see from lowest to highest, virtually all Americans would have had a significant tax increase if we went entirely off the cliff. Varies somewhat by income level, was somewhat higher at high income levels. The other big result was the color scheme you see here, that a lot of the focus on the fiscal cliff was about the tax cuts that were originally enacted under President Bush in 2001 and 2003. Those grabbed the headlines. But the reality is there was actually many other tax provisions that were either expiring or starting at the start of the year, and that it was also important to distinguish different categories of tax cuts among those that were originally enacted in 2001 and 2003. And so what my colleagues and I did is we went through all of the tax provisions that were part of the fiscal cliff, and we put them into 9 different bins, which I realize is a lot, but they were all important and distinct, and we thought it was useful to track them. You can see them on the sheet of paper in front of you, or hopefully on the screen here. They included such things as the alternative minimum tax patch. We've just lived through about a decade in which the alternative minimum tax was scheduled to expand to many more households, from roughly 3 or 4 million households to roughly 25 or 30 million households. But Congress would periodically step in to prevent that, and one of the big questions at the cliff was whether they would do that. There were the tax cuts that were enacted under President Bush originally that primarily affected low and moderate income households. There were then, of course, also the ones that primarily affected high income households, both on their ordinary income and on the ones that affected capital income, capital gains, and dividends. In orange on the chart here, you can see that there was the estate tax. The estate tax was scheduled to go up at the beginning of the year. You can see in a lighter orange things called the extenders. This is several dozen provisions, mostly corporate, some individual, that have been renewed for a year at a time, typically, sometimes 2 years, but are scheduled to expire. And virtually all of those were scheduled to expire at the end of last year. Some had actually expired at the beginning of the year. You see in the light yellow here that President Obama enacted back in 2009 some tax credits that were particularly focused on lower income and moderate income folks. Those were scheduled to expire at the beginning of the year. And then you see in blue at the bottom the payroll tax cut. 2 years ago, there was enacted a temporary payroll tax cut as a form of economic stimulus. You can see that in particular affects folks at all income levels, and that was scheduled to expire at the end of the year, end of last year. Okay, and so this was what was teed up. That basically, oh, I'm sorry, I left out one. And then also, sort of in the purpley color just above the blue there were the taxes that were originally enacted in 2010's health reform that were scheduled to begin at the beginning of this year. And so you have all these different tax provisions that were scheduled to strike at the start of the year. Take them all together, they add up to a pretty big hit. And now if the flipping works, we'll see this is what actually happened. Okay, so same scale, same structure. This is what happens under the American Taxpayer Relief Act. And let me just do my flippy a little bit here so you can kind of visualize what's going on in your mind. Couple things that leap out. Okay, first of all, the bars on what actually happened are by and large much lower than what was scheduled to happen. In rough orders of magnitude, the act that was signed into law last week avoided just less than 2/3 of the scheduled fiscal cliff. So a little more than 1/3 of the cliff happened, and a little less than 2/3 of it was avoided. The part that happened, as you can see here, for most Americans was the expiration of the payroll tax cut. Now that was something that was always intended as a temporary tax cut. It was stimulus. We knew one day it would go away. The political debate would be when, and Congress and the president decided that now was the time, that after 2 years, the payroll tax cut would be allowed to expire. As a result, essentially all working American families are seeing their taxes go up this year relative to what they were last year by around 1 percentage point on average. It's actually a 2 percentage point for those who are working. It's 1 percentage across all households. So that's the biggest part for the vast majority of Americans, that what actually was allowed to happen in the cliff. If you look over at the top 1%, though, you can see that essentially 3 other things happened. Okay. Again, in the purplish color, you can see that the tax increases that were scheduled in 2010's health reform went into effect. Those were almost overwhelmingly focused on folks earning $200,000 or $250,000 or more. And in the grayish color here, you can see that the tax cuts originally enacted in 2001 and 2003 were not allowed to entirely continue, and in fact, most of them expired. You can see that not all of them expired. The gray bars on the original chart are larger than the ones that actually go into effect. For example, dividend taxes were scheduled to rise back up to ordinary tax rates at the end of the year. The new law instead just keeps them at capital gains rates, rising to 20, plus, of course, the health reform taxes. And whereas the fiscal cliff would have had the old 39.6% tax bracket kick in at a lower rate, lower income level under the deal that was struck, that kicks in for folks who have taxable income of $400,000 or $450,000 or higher. So most of the cliff, takeaway here, most of the cliff was avoided. The AMT patch was solved and in fact was patched permanently. And so from a budget and geek point of view, I actually find that nice in terms of communications, that at least we will no longer be constantly having discussions about is the AMT patched or not patched. It is now permanently patched. The majority of the kind of low and middle income tax cuts that were enacted under President Bush were fully extended. President Obama's credits that were enacted in 2009 were not permanently extended, but they were extended for 5 years. Most of the extenders were continued. You can see there's just a little sliver of orange and yellow here. The estate tax deal and the extender deal that were enacted didn't avoid the entire cliff, but they avoided the vast majority of the cliff for those provisions. And then just quickly, the other quick takeaway you can have from this chart is obviously what the pattern is, that in the full fiscal cliff, most Americans were looking at an average tax increase of 3 or 4 percentage points, and at the very high end, it was about 7 percentage points. What happened is that at low and moderate income levels, folks avoided at least 2/3, if not more, of the pending tax increases. But folks in the top 1% didn't get as much of a break. Right? You'll see that their average tax rate went up by about 4.5 percentage points here. They were saved from, in essence, 1/3 of the cliff that was facing them, and they bore the brunt of the other 2/3. And that President Obama has, in fact, been successful in his goal of having more of the tax burden shifted to high-income folks.